Good evening. I'm Commissioner Joanne Hardesty, and thank you so much for coming this evening to hear about our plans for the City of Portland's fall bump process. I am very pleased to be part of this program this evening. As you know, the City of Portland will be voting on the fall bump. We'll start the process on the 28th, which is next Wednesday. We had a preview of what has been proposed this Wednesday. And tonight we're going to talk to some community partners about what they would like to see come out of this fall bump process. So we have an hour and a half together this evening. I'm thrilled that we're going to be actually digging deep into the budget. And let me just say that if you haven't done it already, I want to encourage all of you to go to rethinkportland.com, which is an effort being led out of my office to really reimagine what community safety looks like for all of us. And so at this time, it is my pleasure to introduce Jessica Kennard. She is the director of the budget office, and she's going to walk through what has been presented to me and my colleagues as far as the fall bump process right now. Thank you, Jessica, for being here.
Thank you so much, Commissioner. Greetings, everybody. Good evening. As the Commissioner mentioned, my name is Jessica Kennard, and I am the city's budget director. And I am here just to provide a little bit of context and background around the city's budget and the budget process that we're in right now, which is called the fall bump, which has become more regular nomenclature than I would have ever expected this fall. So let me see if I'm trying to share my screen here and get that into presentation view. Tonight, I always like to start presentations with a little bit about what the city does, because we have a lot of different jurisdictions that operate in and around the city of Portland that provide services to the public. And so specifically at the city, we tend to group our activities generally from a budgeting standpoint into these major service areas. And so these are the major service areas when we think about the services we provide in Portland. It's transportation, some transportation services. Our public utilities include our Bureau of Environmental Services and our Water Bureau. Our public safety services include the Police Bureau, Fire and Rescue, emergency management, and our emergency communications or 911 call taking system. We have, of course, our Parks and Recreation system, which manages not just our city parks, but some of our public golf courses and the Portland International Raceway. We have a whole host of community development services, which includes permitting services, planning and sustainability, community and civic life, and then housing and cable franchising services. And we also support the Joint Office of Homeless Services, which is a joint venture between the city and the county. And then finally, we have our city support services, which are sort of those back office functions, those administrative functions that help all of those frontline services provide services directly to the community. So when you look at our total budget, we have about $5.6 billion, and this is everything. These are all different types of revenue sources, and this includes our operating budgets as well as our capital budget and our reserves and everything. When you look at that total budget, that $5.6 billion, and you look at how it's divided amongst those service areas, this is what you see. I've taken the liberty, I've heard feedback from some folks in prior presentations that they want to see the Police Bureau's apportionment specifically called out. So you'll see the red colors represent sort of public safety as a whole, and the darker red is non-police public safety, and the brighter red is police. So again, this is all resources, not just general fund discretionary resources, which we'll talk about in a minute. When it comes to all of our resources, the biggest bureaus and the biggest service areas are our public utilities and our administration and support. And that's primarily because they have, both of those bureaus have really large multi-year capital plans and financial plans. And so they build up big reserves and funding to fund large projects over a series of several years. So this chart is meant to show sort of the division of our resources. And what you see here is that the vast majority of our resources, about 90% of the city's $5.6 billion, is what we refer to as sort of dedicated resources. And what that means is that the resource that we take in, we can't spend on just anything we want. Those resources have to be spent on specific things. So the clearest example of this is when you pay your water and your sewer bill, the city can't take that money and decide to spend it on, say, homeless services or parks or something else that they want to do. They have to spend that money legally on supporting the sewer and the water systems, which you've paid into. So most of our resources are for dedicated things. The green rectangle here represents about 10% of our budget. That's discretionary resource, primarily comes from tax resources, and those resources we refer to as general fund. When you hear general fund or general fund discretionary, these are the resources that council and the city has a significant amount of discretion on how they allocate those resources. So when you look at the discretionary funds this year in our adopted budget, we have about $570 million, and you look at those same service areas, this is how those discretionary resources are allocated across the city. So you see the biggest component there is public safety, and so you can see the division there also between the brighter red is police bureau and the darker red is non-police public safety, predominantly fire as the recipient of general fund in that darker red category. And then you see the next largest category is parks and recreation, followed by community development. And I would say that probably about half of what's in that community development budget for discretionary funds is funds that are going to our Joint Office of Homeless Services. So the process that we're in right now is called a few different things that can be referred to as a supplemental budget or a budget monitoring process, which is where we get the BMP for fall bump. We have a couple of different types of processes in the city related to budgeting. We budget pretty much year round. Our major process is typically what we call our annual adopted budget process. And this happens, the decision making happens in the spring, and it leads up to the next fiscal year. Our fiscal year starts on July 1 and runs into June 30th. And it's a very long process. Bureaus are starting to build their budgets for next year already right now. It takes several months, and a lot of our big decisions are typically held during that time. The fall bump, the fall budget monitoring or supplemental budget process, and the spring supplemental budget process are typically opportunities to sort of make adjustments. The annual budget is a plan, it's a roadmap, but we have to make adjustments during the year. Things change, urgent needs come up, we need to make adjustments. And so we have these times when we plan on opening the budget to make those adjustments. Typically they're pretty technical in nature, but this fall is a little bit different for a couple of reasons. The first is that obviously we're in a global pandemic. That pandemic has had significant financial implications for a variety of different revenue sources in the city. We were on track we thought we were on track last January and February to a surplus budget situation, and very quickly that changed for our general fund. We updated our forecast in April to reflect a $75 million decline in general fund resource, and we took a variety of strategies to try to balance the budget. The strategies are listed on this slide. I will say of note here is that we did levy cuts, about 5.6% cuts across all general fund bureaus. Most of those cuts were met by freezing wages and materials and services costs. But where those measures weren't sufficient, bureaus were asked to bring forward additional cuts as part of this fall bump process. Additionally, there were some notable changes to the police bureau's budget that happened throughout the process. And this is a list of some of those items now. The city budget office does have a kind of a summary document that tries to explain the different changes to the budget throughout the process that's on our website that I would encourage folks to look at if you have additional questions, or I think I have a couple minutes afterwards and I can answer questions there as well. But basically, so the mayor's proposed budget included the 5.6% reduction, which was about $12 million, as was the case, as was the reduction that was directed for other general fund bureaus as well. It also included some programmatic and one-time reductions in addition to that 5.6%. Council then, as part of the approved budget process, so our process goes first, the mayor proposes the budget, council has the opportunity to amend or approve, and amend and then approve it. As part of that amendment process, an additional $1.9 million was removed for sobering center services from the police bureau's budget and put into a set aside. And then finally, the bulk of the changes that I'm sure many of you might recall came during the final stage, which was the adopted budget stage. There were a number of amendments that were passed, which eliminated about $15 million and 84 sworn positions as part of the adopted budget process. As a result of that, some of the money was reallocated to specific set-asides and specific purposes, but about 1.46 million was not allocated and fell to the general fund contingency and is available for appropriation as part of this fall bump process. So then the decisions in front of the council right now during this fall bump are some of the things that we typically see, which are more technical adjustments. But then there's also the consideration of the Bureau cuts, that the remainder of that 5.6% cut that bureaus were directed to bring. There's also a discussion around the allocation of available resources, which includes our one-time contingency, but also ongoing contingency resources for urgent needs. And then of course, the continuation of policy discussions that were held during the adopted budget process. And we're always looking ahead, since we're always budgeting, we're always looking ahead to the next budget process. So we're thinking about and we're trying to prepare for the next annual budget as well. This is where we're at in our fall bump timeline. So you can see bureaus have submitted their requested budgets. We've updated our general fund forecast. We have held a couple of budget outreach events, and council has held a work session, and then we're looking towards next week. We have our council hearing is scheduled on October 28th. The ordinance as filed does not have what's called an emergency clause, which allows us to vote on the same day. So we do anticipate that the vote will occur at this point the week afterwards. The hearing will occur on the 28th as planned, and then the vote will occur the week afterwards. Here are just some links if you're interested in learning a little bit more. We try to create materials and resources that will be helpful for the public in understanding what's in the budget. I'd recommend the visualization. It's through Tableau. You can interact with the budget data and sort of drill into the area that you are interested in seeing more of if you go to that link. With that, I will conclude my presentation, and depending on the time availability, I am available to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Jessica. There was a question, and I know you covered it, but I think the listener may have missed it. And the question was, what is non-police public safety budget?
Yeah, so so non-police, the bureaus that are in the public safety area that are not police include Portland Fire and Rescue, and they are a large recipient of general fund resources. So when you look at that general fund pie, the dark red slice that's not police bureau is mostly fire and rescue. Also includes our 911 call taking system, which I think has about $16 million or so of general fund discretionary. And then it also includes our Bureau of Emergency Management, which is a small bureau, but is mighty. They are certainly coordinating our emergency response for the past several months. And then we actually have a separate non-general fund bureau that's called the Fire and Police Disability and Retirement System. And we have a separate system, a separate levy that voters approved that funds the retirement benefits for our sworn police and firefighters, and they have their own bureau and their own resources.
Jessica, you always make the budget sound so simple. I thank you for that. Let's see if there's any other questions. There is not. So thank you so much, Jessica. I really appreciate you taking time to be here this evening. And what we know is that Jessica's office is always accessible. So if there's additional questions, we will get those questions answered. I really appreciate you taking time to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioners. My pleasure.
Thank you. And so now I want to invite my community partners to make their presentation on what their desires are around the fall bump. And we have joining us tonight, Imagine Black, formerly PALF. We have Unite Oregon, and we have the People's, I'm sorry, it just went out of my brain. Han, tell me again, what is the name of your organization?
Portland Metro People's Coalition.
Thank you. See, that's why we should never use acronyms, because we get stuck in the acronyms, and when we have to say it, we forget. Thank you all for being here tonight. I understand that you have developed a joint presentation. We look forward to it. Take it away.
Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
And feel free to introduce yourself before you speak, just so our listeners and watchers will know.
Definitely. I just want to make sure that you all are seeing everything okay.
Looking good. Looking good.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. My name is Lamara Haynes. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I work for Imagine Black as an advocacy manager. Imagine Black, formerly known as PALF, Portland African American Leadership Forum. and I'm doing this presentation in conjunction with Hyung Nam from Portland Metro People's Coalition and Jasmine Casanova Dean from Unite Oregon. All right, so we're gonna go to slide number 2. So community has been calling for a $50 million divestment from Portland Police Bureau, PPB. We believe that in the future, we will have a police-free society and all our basic needs will be met. So something that has been coming up lately during the COVID pandemic, as well as the ever-long pandemic of systemic racism in this country, is that law enforcement does not keep us safe. During this time, we've seen mutual aid efforts, neighbors watching out for neighbors, families taking care of each other, and friends taking care of each other as the main source of people finding respite, stability, and access to resources. So in lieu of this and the historical context of policing, which comes out of slave patrols, which returned enslaved African people back into bondage, as well as militias that were used to remove indigenous people from their lands, we know that policing in itself is inherently violent, and there's no room for reforming it. And a way to move towards the future we want is to divest from the PPP on a yearly basis in fairly large chunks of money. We came to the 50 million number earlier this year by looking at the way the PPP budget has been increased under our current mayor. And so in June, we won a 15 million divestment, and now we're calling for 35 million to get us to that 50. And we believe that when we divest from PPP, we need to reinvest in non-punitive programming, such as programs that house and keep our houseless community members housed permanently, drug and alcohol treatment programming, as well as programs that really invest in those who are predominantly impacted by the carceral state, that being Black folks, folks with disabilities, our Indigenous community members, as well as people who are from the immigrant and refugee community. So we keep those in mind. Again, funding for law enforcement actively reduces funding from other bureaus and programs. Many people have received their ballots and the voter guide, and you'll notice that there's a few levies and bonds in order to fund our libraries, our public transit system, as well as just our roadways. And we believe that if we divest from PPP and invest in these programs, we'll see a much healthier and better society, especially for those already marginalized by police violence. I'm gonna go to the next slide.
So what we want,
go for it, Jasmine.
okay. Yeah, so what we want in terms of how we want to get to we want an immediate 35 million divestment from PPP, Portland Police Bureau. We want to dramatically limit our community's contact with the police. We want to demilitarize the police, limit their roles and functions in our communities, a ban on non-lethal munitions, banning PPP use of abuse of overtime, and reimagining community safety and make real investments and new approaches. We also want a Portland Police Bureau hiring freeze, and an immediate cut in 189 sworn officer positions. Another thing some people might be wondering, well, how are we supposed to limit the 35 million? Some things I'm just going to shout them out is stop surveillance, brutalization, and repossession of Portlanders using militarized equipment, cut the public relations section to the police budget, as in that they don't need to be making announcements and press releases, fully defund the police department specialty units that were canceled in June but have not been fully defunded, reduce significant officer interacted contacts with police, as in the Sunshine Division and things like that. Lamar, could you please go to the next slide?
Sure.
Okay, so then with what we want as in defunding, where do we want to reinvest these things? Lamar touched on it a little bit earlier. We want to see programs that house and keep houseless folks housed, comprehensive reentry services for formerly incarcerated persons, so such as building upon the clean slate program that we already have, making it more easy and more widely spread out throughout Oregon. Civilian servants and social workers can perform 90% of the current police duties. So that meaning like traffic stop, mental health calls, domestic disputes, physical violence, things, threat of physical violence, things like that can be reallocated to other entities that are already there that can do and have that training. So giving the money from the Portland Police and putting it into those. We also want community-centered health and safety modules developed in strong partnership with the community. So actually having the community be a part, again, like Lamar touched on earlier, education, parks, libraries, public transit, community gardens, all these things that we're asking people to pay with taxes, we need to be taking away from the police bureau and putting it into our community. And as well as job training and placement for business, investing in Black business, investing in Black-led businesses, investing in alternatives to education besides mainstream high school education are just a few of the things that we want to see invested into the community. Again, we're asking for a reinvestment into the community, not into other forms of oppression that targets Black and people of color. And then Lamarck, if you could go over another slide. And then what else we're asking for, like Lamar touched on earlier, is defunding the police and incarceration. So we can't keep overfunding police while we use special taxes for everything else. Lamar was touching on that earlier. Again, that goes back to reinvesting into the community and not asking people to spend more money than they already don't have to have a sustainable living lifestyle, and reduce the scope of policing. Like I had mentioned earlier, getting rid of certain entities and special groups.
All right, next slide. And here, these slides are yours. So, oops.
So, you know, I'm a public school teacher, and for the 20 years that I've been teaching, for almost every single year, we've had to deal with austerity and budget cuts. And it's just incredible that the system that we've gotten so used to just keeps us stuck in these cycles of not having enough funds to deal with the real social needs that we have, that then we rely on the police to respond to, and then we never have the money to deal with the real root causes that the police are responding to. So policing costs, and we externalize those costs, right? A lot of those costs are paid for by the county and also by the state. And so that means our funding for everything from healthcare to education is impacted by this. So, you know, we need to address the larger issues like systemic racism, the housing crisis, poverty, lack of living wage jobs, and all kinds of opportunities. I mean, I teach at Wilson High School. My students, there's no concern that a lot of my students whose families have, you know, private membership at the MAC Club are going to be, you know, needing gang enforcement teams. Because they have so many opportunities for enrichment and recreation and so on. Those opportunities need to be available for everybody. So we've been, this is something that former Governor Kitzhaber said before. It costs, and so these costs are even more now, but it costs $10,000 a year to keep a child in school. It costs $30,000 to keep someone in prison. And so this is a system that Portland police constantly feed into that we want to end. We also, for minor offenses of unhoused people, like, you know, stealing a $1.67 bottle of Gatorade, this was a story in the Oregonian, they end up in these state mental hospitals that do nothing to actually help them. And it's a form of prison, really. And it costs, we've spent $35 million a year, and at a cost of $1,323 per person per day. And this is just incredible. Next slide, please.
Sure.
And one thing that I want to point out is the cost of overtime. And really the only way that we can reduce this ridiculous cost of overtime is by reducing the actual staffing of the police force. So that means at each of the precincts, that means our detached units and our specialty units, because or else they will just keep on hiring overtime to keep the staffing going at the precincts. So recently, the Oregonian reported that many police officers made over $200,000 a year when counting their overtime. So some of the worst officers, like Nazi Mark Kruger, made over $200,000. In fact, he was at the top of the list. And he, along with Ken Duilo, formerly from the gang enforcement team, who's had a very problematic history of racism that I think many people could speak about, made over $90,000 strictly in overtime. This is just a complete mismanagement that's been audited, and the commissioner of police has not done his job in managing the abuse of overtime. So we need to eliminate overtime, and we need to reduce the size of the police force with both detached units and specialty units and at each precinct patrol. So I know from being on the Police Budget Advisory Committee that they had already been planning extra overtime for policing the protests, but they've already blown over $2 million of that budget. And then they're going to be expecting to draw even more money from the rest of our general funds on top of their bloated budgets to cover so much more over policing that brutalizes the public. And let's remember that all these brutalities are going to cost us in terms of civil suits, which every single survivor and victim's family deserve every single penny that they're getting. But we need to make sure that we stop future harms by cutting these forces and cutting the cops. So next slide, please. And so I want to talk about some specific units that we want to defund. We want to end the rapid response team. Those are the riot cops that have been federally deputized now. They did not exist before 2001, around the same time that the DHS, Department of Homeland Security, federally was created. We can go back to having a Portland where that unit did not exist. And we see from everything that they've done and from studies, many studies that have shown that those kinds of militarized police units dressed for war basically endanger the public safety and actually endanger themselves. And we know from the munitions that they've used, they've actually been a danger to public health and the environment as well. We also want to end the Special Emergency Response Team. That's the name that we have for SWAT. Originally, they did not exist until the late 60s, and originally they were called the Special Weapons Attack Team. We do not need a Special Weapons Attack Team, constantly. And same thing with the Criminal Intelligence Unit, which is a surveillance unit that comes from the former Red Squad. We know that the Portland Police has done very little to protect us from far-right terrorists, as identified by the FBI and DHS, and instead have been focused on trying to go after activists, Black Lives Matter, and so on. And so we want those specific units ended, all their tools and weapons, riot gear, etc., unfunded. Next slide, please. And furthermore, other specialty units and detached units, we want to end the Narcotics Division. I mean, why should we fund the Narcotics Division at the same rate that we were funding before we legalized cannabis? And we know that incarceration does not help people with problems. We need to end these units. Same thing with the behavioral health unit. We need actual social workers, and we need to address the real the root of the problem, rather than having cops respond to people and having people that are primarily trained to use violence and armed to try to be social workers. That just does not make sense. Same thing with the service coordination team, the Youth Services Division, which is still tied to the SROs and GVRT. We need to completely defund those programs and units. All these units increase policing, therefore harm towards people in crisis. These teams and specialty units do not serve the public. They surveil, harass, and attack our communities, often under the guise of livability. Next slide, please. And we want to make sure that this is not a huge ticket item as far as cost goes. But again, it's a huge ticket item in terms of future costs because it's doing real harm and damage to people that are going to be paid for in lawsuits, but also just huge harm to the public. I mean, this is such a great example to show that the police are not about public safety. They are, they endanger public safety. So we want to end the use of crowd control munitions, riot gear, and all the warrior style training. Crowd control policing has resulted in increased costs in legal claims, record number of claims that we're going to be facing, that we're going to be paying for many years. We know that some cities have had to resort to borrowing money to pay these kind of claims. We also know that our high deductible insurance premium will likely go up. And so again, we don't want to shortchange the victims and survivors, but we want to make sure that we stop the harms from happening in the future. And again, all of this has been pointed out by the IPR in a policy review that came out in March 2018 from the fascist rally from June 2017. And it's so ironic that just a few months afterwards, in August of 2018, the cops did the same thing and brutalized people, right? The same thing that we're blaming the federal cops for, where one of these suits is one of our anti-fascist people that came out, and he had a helmet on, and the cop shot him through the helmet from the back. And so that is from 2018, not from the recent protest this year that we're going to be facing a settlement for coming up. Next slide, please.
In conclusion, we need an immediate $35 million divestment from PPB and reinvestment into non-punitive programming. Again, that could be a plethora of things. And during the COVID pandemic and economic crises, we should not be proposing cuts to Portland street response, as the mayor has suggested in prior meetings. We need to actually take the funds from PPB and reinvest them into Portland street response and the Emergency Coordination Center. These are programs that are non-punitive, with folks who are trained to not be physically violent, who are trained in ways that bring about feelings of empathy and solidarity and safety for people who are marginalized and who are impacted by things that are compounded by inadequate systems that produce racism and other systemic oppressions. And a call to action for folks who are listening. You can use the following links to go ahead and send an action letter to City Council in order to echo the demands here. And you can also reach out to our organizations as well. And our emails are listed here. And if you would like access to these slides, you can go to our websites and shoot us an email and we can send it over to you as well. Links to the slides that are links to the documentation in the slides. And that is it for this presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that very excellent presentation. Before I get to questions, I just want to thank each of you because even for me, going through a $35 billion budget is a hard thing. A $3 billion budget is a hard thing to do. So I can just imagine how challenging it is for people who are outside of City Hall. And so first, I just want to really appreciate the thoughtfulness that you put into your presentation. So without further ado, let's jump into the questions that have come up. The very first question is, as advocates and activists, how do you think the public can limit the power of the police union?
Well, right now, I would say one of the ways to limit the power is to use our action tools, to use that saying that you want 35 million. The more and more and more people use these action tools, the more people can show, like Commissioner Hardesty and the fellow, I wanted to say student, and the fellow city council, that the community wants this. It's not just organization. Community also wants this as well. We speak for communities, but you doing that extra step to go use these action tools from either Unite Oregon or Imagine Black, formerly known as PALF, use those action tools and send that in, tap into what these organizations are doing and what we're saying, and let us know how we can better serve. But I would say for right now, it is using that action tool and stating that you want that 35 million.
Anybody else want to weigh in? I see heads going up and down. Next question. Do you worry about a drastic rise in crime if we take money out of the police bureau's budget?
I would like to respond to that.
Please.
You know, we know that violent crime has been going down for quite a while. And it's interesting that we really have a rare chance to cut the police budget, just because, like with the last question, the police union has been such a powerful force in our city. But the one time in recent history that we did do that was after the last recession in 2010. We did cut the police budget. And it was interesting to see that that trend towards decreasing of violent crime just continued during that same period. So we know that that can happen. But of course, I think the big case that we want to make here is that it's not enough just to cut the police funding. We need to reinvest in our communities to address the root level of issues like inequality. We've got record inequality in this country and in this city. And largely what the police are doing is responding to inequality and the power of the 1% against those that are disenfranchised from our system.
That's a great place for us to end this conversation, but we'll certainly pick it up at the end of this conversation this evening. We're going to now present the budget that my office has been working on as part of the fall bump process. Kristen Johnson, my financial advisor, will be making the presentation. And Kristen's going to start with what our original budget was. And Kristen, I think if you start there, then I'll come back on and talk about what's changed since we developed our original proposed budget changes, and then we can get to where we are right now. If that sounds good.
Sounds good. Yep. Just gonna share my screen. Okay. So thank you everybody for giving me the chance to share what we're thinking. And I really want to uplift the community and let you know that what we're going to propose has been informed by the tens of thousands of emails and calls we've gotten. We've reached out and met with advocates. We've heard the calls in the streets, and we've held community events. And none of this is our thinking. This is us taking your best thinking and doing what we can with it. So thank you so much for that. And it really aligns with the commissioner's vision for community safety. Her vision, as informed by all of you, has 5 major tenets: to reduce and limit the size and scope of our police force, to reinvest those dollars in community, to create alternatives to police like Portland Street Response and other programs, to decriminalize nonviolent offenses, and to demilitarize officers. I'm going to scroll down and show that our original budget proposal would have totaled $36 million, and it would have cut 164 positions. You're probably wondering why it's not that much at this point, and the commissioner will get into that in a moment. We did back out some items just a couple days ago based on new information, but I will share quickly where we are at. And I want to be very clear that as we work towards getting this for next week, we got to work with our colleagues to get the votes for this. So, some of these details could change, but our office is committed to an $18 million cut And so here's where we're at right now. A portion of the mayor's 5.6% cut was one time, and we are suggesting that it become ongoing. There were a number of retirees. There were 48 retirees in August from the Bureau. We want to eliminate 42 of those 48. The 6 that we are not able to eliminate are sergeant positions, and those are required by the DOJ settlement that we are currently under. We are working to eliminate an IGA, an intergovernmental agreement, with the Multnomah County DA's office, where the Police Bureau is helping to fund investigators who issue subpoenas. We are wanting to cut the CERT and RRT budgets, as previously talked about in the presentation. I just want to point out, it probably seems weird that they look so small, knowing how big those units are each night. And the reason that is the case is because traditionally these units are sort of amorphous. They're not static in that there are officers assigned to these units all the time, and that's all they do. You know, they come together around events or different things. So these reductions represent the amount that's budgeted for their materials and services and other things. Unfortunately, unless and until Commissioner Hardesty becomes the Police Bureau's commissioner, she can't tell them how to operate. We can't eliminate those units because they could still be there in practice. So we have taken suggesting their material and services budgets. We want to eliminate the practice of secondary employment and reduce overtime. Secondary employment is an agreement between the Police Bureau and another entity. For example, you may have seen officers at the Apple store downtown. We don't believe that corporations should be able to buy Police Bureau time and use them as private security. We would like to reduce their external materials and services. That's the part of their budget that they use to contract with people, buy weapons, buy whatever it is they're buying, and reduce their city fleet costs, since we know that a number of positions have been eliminated in the adopted, and we're calling for a reduction of another 42. So at this point, I will leave this up and I will let the commissioner talk about why we went from 36 to 18 million.
So, Kristen, I don't mind you bringing it back up, but why don't you take it down?
Okay.
So that I can see the people I'm talking to.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
No worry. And so I'm sure you're thinking, well, if you started with 36 million, why are you now down to 18? And you may know that we are currently still under a Department of Justice settlement agreement that actually requires the Portland Police Bureau to have a certain level of staffing, which is why when Kristen talked about the retirees, that the sergeants were not cut. In addition, as you've noticed with the current federal government, deputizing people that we have not agreed to have deputized, not undeputizing them when we tell them we don't want them to be deputized. We're very
So folks, we appear to have lost the commissioner. I'm sure she'll be back momentarily as she reconnects. Kristen, do you want to just kind of keep going with where you were
Yeah,
at?
I can talk about our reinvestments.
All right.
Okay, let me bring that back up. Okay, yeah, and the commissioner will be back. So we have a number of ways that we would like to reinvest these funds. So the proposed amendments are for an additional $18 million cut. And those funds are ongoing, which means they're available year after year unless council makes a decision otherwise. And we are proposing to use them on a one-time basis for the remainder of this fiscal year, and then some other things to do ongoing when we start the next fiscal year on July 1, 2021. You can see that all of the reinvestments we are talking about are directed towards the community. We want to get and increase our food assistance. We want to increase digital access for disabled community members and shorten the digital divide. We want to invest in universal eviction defense and keep people who are on the brink of potentially becoming houseless in their homes. We want to continue funding the porta potties and hygiene stations that have been up since COVID started for our houseless neighbors, as well as continue the funding for the C3PO shelters. We want to fund $300,000 for household essentials for things like diapers and food and tampons that people might need. And then some enhanced crisis intervention training for the Fire Bureau, as they are seeing an uptick in calls from community members who are experiencing a mental health crisis and who in those moments have told the fire department that they don't want to interact with police. And so then we have some investments that we are working on for the beginning of next fiscal year, which would be the creation of a Latinx Youth Leadership Development Fund, similar to the Black Youth Leadership Development Fund that the commissioner created. Some additional funding for Portland Street Response as we work to gear up and be available 24/7 citywide. And then some of the money will be in contingency for either what we are facing as budget cuts going into this next year to help offset those budget cuts so that bureaus other than police don't have to take more cuts, or to continue and have money available for other emergent community needs as we continue to fight COVID and don't really know when that's going to end. I'd like to point out that we did have a line item for a participatory budgeting process in here, but the mayor and Commissioner Udaley have put that into the mayor's fall bump proposal. So that's why you won't see that there. It's already in the mayor's proposal, and we are in alignment with that. The commissioner is back.
Yes, I am. My apologies. My computer just died on me for the moment. But luckily, you can't keep a good woman down because I had two computers side by side. So my apologies. So I was talking about both the Department of Justice settlement agreement. And the good news is that even though we have invested tens of millions of dollars into the police bureau due to the settlement agreement, we are scheduled to be done with that agreement in February of 2021. And so I want to make sure that we as a council don't do anything to trigger the federal government saying that we, in fact, are not in compliance. You may have read that the community oversight, community liaison person just 2 weeks ago announced that Portland was no longer in compliance with the settlement agreement. But it was around paperwork. It wasn't around actions that were being taken. And so there are quarterly reports that Portland Police Bureau has to turn in on their use of force. And they did not turn in those reports for the second quarter of this year. And that is what flagged the COCO to say we were out of compliance. But our attorneys are now working with the Department of Justice in DC to determine what that means, because we don't know yet whether that means that extends our timeline, whether the clock has stopped and will start again once we're back in compliance. And so in this budget process, I wanted to be very careful to not trigger additional federal engagement in that settlement agreement. What we know is that Portland Police Bureau is already saying that they can't do anything because we cut $15 million out of their budget in June. But we know that's simply not true. It is really how they choose to staff, like putting 30 riot cops outside of the Portland Police Union's building does nothing to enhance public safety or to address the issues in the 911 calls that police have not been responding to. And so as a strategic move, we did not feel that in this budget, we could go after the whole $36 million. And so I just want to make sure you guys understand that we are in alignment as far as our values are concerned, but strategically, I want to make sure that me and my colleagues are operating in a way that does not trigger more involvement by our by the federal government, especially this federal government. Any questions about that? Hearing no questions about that, let me also say that we've been working very closely with Commissioner Udaley's office on this budget and trying to make sure that this budget truly reflects the values that we all share. Making sure that we are actually using the values that we started this conversation with about limiting the scope of policing, making sure police do the job that they've been hired to do, which is to solve crime. And so I think at this point, I'm going to see, are there any questions about that? So now we're going to open it up for discussion and see, I see a lot of alignment in what the community is asking for and what my office has been advocating for as well. But let's open it up and have a conversation.
I would just like to go back to the question somebody asked about the uptick in crime, defunding the police. And I think there's a lot of things happening when folks ask that question.
Yes.
And one of them is we spend a lot of time watching television, and the way in which it's depicted on TV is not the way in which it actually happens.
Yes.
So police respond to crime after it happens. So that's really key to remember, right? A crime has already been committed. The idea that police are like out in the cut and like looking for crime and then jump out and stop it is very much fictional, right? That's not what actually happens. So, and when we think about crime and criminality, who are we afraid of? I think is really important to think about, right? We criminalize houseless people for living outside because they literally do not have a place to live indoors, right?
Yes.
So things that you would normally do outside, do in your house, you know, sleep, defecating, walking around, eating, are now seen as a problem because you're doing it outdoors. So what we need
data definitely backs you up on that. What we know is that last year, right, over 50% of the arrests were of people, but for being houseless, they would have never been arrested. What we know nationally is that crime is going up nationally in every urban community. And if you look at history, crime goes up when there's an economic uncertainty, right? And so I'm not surprised, and the public should not be surprised that crime is on an uptick when people have been stuck at home for 3 to 4 months. People have lost their jobs. They're worried about being evicted. There's a lot of anxiety in our community, right? And that anxiety has been compounded by the COVID-19. It's been compounded by the economic cliff that we're about to go over. It's been compounded by the racial justice movement that is front and center at the moment. It's also been compounded by forest fires and other things that are truly outside of our control, right? And so I absolutely agree with you, Lamar, when you say that, you know, it is not, we cannot look at the uptick in crime and then make the association that it's because we have less police officers, because that's simply not true. And B, it's a quick response. It's a quick solution to systemic problems. And the systemic problems of, as Young said earlier, right? Racism, lack of opportunity, lack of access, those problems that were here before the pandemic, and they've only been exacerbated by the pandemic.
I would just like to say that data from last year shows that only 70% of calls, were not calls of immediate danger. So 26% of the calls were crime related calls. The other 74% were incidents that were described not as crime. So incidents where no immediate response was required, no one was in danger, no one needed a police officer. And out of those 26, most of them were calls related to a suspicious person.
Yes. Oh, you've done your
So
homework, Jasmine. I'm
yeah,
impressed because
yeah.
that's
So
normally
because
my line.
that's one of the things that a lot of people, a lot of the public jump to is fear. And like Lamar is saying, that's from media and also just general fear of us being hurt. But when you look at the data, this is data. This is not manipulated. This can't be manipulated. This is straight facts that they are not stopping crime.
That's
So taking away police officers isn't going to increase crime. I just wanted to throw out facts out there because that's very important that we.
No, I was headed there, Jasmine, but you beat me to it. Thank you. Was there anything missing that's a high priority from you and the budget that Kristen presented?
There was something from.
Oh, sorry,
Go ahead,
Jasmine, go ahead.
So there was something from the budget, the proposed budget. I believe it's the second line down, and it says like community prospect or something like that from the long-term section of where the 18 million would go.
Kristen, would you bring that back up so we can just look at it for a moment?
Oh no, from the reinvestment section. Okay, maybe I was thinking of something else. I think the only thing to me that, like, I'm understanding COVID is very important. I think the only thing that I'm wondering is in that long-term investment besides the Latinx community development, is there going to be any other forms of reinvestment that we had listed, such as, you know, putting back into parks, libraries, job training, placement, uplifting the Black community, uplifting poor communities, such as we would say Southeast Portland and out in Gresham? Is there anything like that going on? Because I didn't see it in the proposal, so I just want to know if that's something that we would need, because in ours, it's going into community, and I just want to make sure that, you know, yes, COVID relief is important, but also is there any long-term aspects for the community, especially for the Black community?
So that is really a great question. And I know that the mayor had proposed a $3 million participatory budgeting process that was specific to the Black community. And my original proposal had $5 million for a process like that for the Black community. And it should be an ongoing process, because what we know about COVID is that we have not hit the worst in our second wave of COVID as of yet. We're still in phase 1 of reopening, right? We've never moved out of phase 1. And so what we know is that COVID, especially now that it's wintertime, flu season is coming, we're going to get hit by COVID again in a hurry. And we don't currently have a federal government that we can depend on. And so the money that we're removing from the police budget, as you saw, we've got a lot of one-time expenditures because we hope that we will have a functioning federal government soon. And if we do, that money could actually be reallocated to invest in other community priorities. But right now, what we know is that we will have thousands of community members that are food insecure, housing insecure, and that's where we think the best investment of those dollars in our community should go at the moment. And I do support a participatory budgeting process that's inclusive of the Black community, so that we can actually invest those dollars where the Black community says they want them to go. Young, I know you had, yes, please.
Yeah, and you know, I know that this is all part of a much longer process of transformation that we're on, but I think even at this stage, especially, you know, I really appreciate that your office is especially advocating for contingency with so much uncertainty with the feds, and being prepared for really the major, eviction tsunami and really the real recession, which we haven't faced yet because it, this stimulus so far that we've gotten has kind of protected us from that. But not knowing what's going to happen, I think it would be great to still cut the rest of the Youth Services Division, which is even though they eliminated the SROs, there's still funding for the Youth Services Division under the SRO program. So eliminate the rest of that, and also eliminate at least some of, even now, the narcotics unit. As I said before, why should they have the same budget they had before we decriminalized or made cannabis legal? And similarly with the criminal intelligence unit, I know that that might be more complicated, but again, since we're out of JTTF and we really want to separate ourselves far from DHS and ICE and actually completely sever ourselves from JTTF, it seems like maintaining the same funding for that program as before we got out of JTTF doesn't make sense. It seems like there should at least be a reduction now and then hopefully elimination of that program when we can.
Hung, I may make you feel a little better by knowing that next Wednesday there will be a resolution at the City Council that I am introducing that will prohibit Portland Police from engaging at all with any federal agents and to otherwise direct it. While I don't think we can cut any additional positions at this time because of the issues that I mentioned earlier, I think that resolution draws a really clear line in the sand. The mayor believes that Portland police officers believe that they're no longer deputized, but I don't trust that, and I know the community doesn't trust that. And so rather than wait to see what happens if there's a court a suit around whether or not we're deputized, it is important. I'm sorry, actually, I've just been corrected that this resolution actually restricts those deputized officers from having any involvement at all with any federal entity at all. I was just corrected. So thank you, Derek. But the resolution is very intentional to make sure that we limit any kind of engagement or interaction with the feds. Because again, if we don't trust our police to actually follow Portland rules and guidelines, we certainly don't want them engaged with the feds at all. So that resolution is at City Council next week. But I feel, and again, I think that our values are very much well aligned. The question about the libraries and parks, libraries are funded by the county. So that is not a city function, but parks competes consistently. And by the way, parks is an unsustainable model, the way we fund parks today. And we have been having this unrestrained model for quite some time. And so it's going to be important for us to come up with a long-range plan to fund parks. We've done a really good job of expanding parks, especially in the East Portland, which didn't have anywhere near the kind of parks that are in some parts of the city. But the parks competes with the police and fire and rescue and the 911 call center for limited general fund dollars. And so that's the primary problem with why we're always struggling with funding parks, is because when you're competing with police, you tend to end up on the losing end. Yes.
Can I just follow up with a couple things? Well, I really appreciate that resolution about getting our cops not to, getting Portland cops not to cooperate with the feds at all. And it seems like, that would be, and I appreciate your concern about, the DOJ thing. But it seems like unless we reduce our forces, if all those units are no longer cooperating with the feds, what are they going to be doing with their time? I mean, can we make sure that we stop having the cops just rack up overtime. I mean, they've been, because, they say that whatever cops are in, busy in whatever detached units, they say, well, to fill our staffing needs at our precinct, we have to use overtime. And it's just ridiculous that so many cops are making more money in overtime than their salaries. So I want to make sure that, we really think about the staffing and make sure that overtime abuse gets stopped. And then just one other thing about the, libraries. Yeah, I mean, the way that we fund things in Portland, libraries and schools are separate, but, the cops are ultimately responding to the lack of resources in our community, right?
Yes.
I mean, my kids at Wilson, when they can go to the MAC club, they don't need the public library, or they don't need so many other kind of resources at community centers that the rest of us need. But
Right.
also, I mean, the SROs are a great example. I mean, we've been cutting our counselors at our schools in PPS, and the SROs, right, coming from the police, have been kind of trying to fill a role of counselors. So, I mean, rather than, if the police can come into our schools, we can have police funds go into our libraries instead.
Thank you. I think the city has enough things we can't fund before we would give our money to the county. So I do appreciate that. I forgot to actually read the question that we were in the middle of answering. And so the question was, why do libraries, parks, and schools have to put their budgets on referendum, while the police, for instance, can spend tens of thousands of dollars a night on munitions against civilians trying to fight for civil rights? So that's the question we were answering, but I forgot to actually verbalize it publicly. Anybody else wanted to weigh in on that question?
Yeah, I'd just like to point out that to the person who asked that question, to their point, it doesn't have to be that way. So, as Commissioner Hardesty has always approached the budgets, they are a moral document, and all of those things are competing for resources. And so, when you took office, your first year, you tried to help keep parks folks employed, and we tried to not have people laid off, and to keep some of the community centers open by getting rid of the gun violence reduction team and other things in PBB that first time. And the will of the council wasn't there behind you. So those are really good questions, and it really comes down to what the will of the council is, and having to get those 3 votes.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Kristen. Thank you very much. Jasmine, I'll let you weigh in, and then I'll get to audience questions.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that, like Christian said, it doesn't have to be that way. And one way it doesn't is you hold the people that you vote in accountable for what you want. And with this action tool, we're asking for the council to invest in parks and libraries. So if you want to make sure your voice is heard, use these action tools, use them, send the email out, send it to the council and let them know we want this. Because then if they don't vote the way that we're asking them to, then that's a sign that we can vote them out. And then that's a sign to the next city council that if you don't do what the public is asking you for, what we asked you to do when we elected you, you're going to get voted out. So that's how you can use the tools that organizations like Unite and Imagine Black set up to speak that voice.
But I just want to make sure that you advocate with the right government for the right thing, right? Because if you come and advocate with me to fund the libraries, I have no mechanism at the city to fund the libraries, right? But I would go to the county and say, you cut the sheriffs and fund the libraries, right? So just make sure you're sending people to the right government for the right issue, okay? That would be my only pushback on that. But I like the fire. Okay, here's another question. Let's see. So where does the money, this is a good one. Where does the money come from for police overtime and settlements from lawsuits against Portland Police Bureau? Let me just say that prior to me serving on the city council, I had never seen a time where the police didn't ask for a budget increase that they didn't get it. And normally here's what happened. The police goes out and talks to neighborhood associations and demands that they need more money so that they can get the neighborhoods and the business associations to put pressure on the council to give them more money. And then the police, through their PIOs, their public information office, goes out and actually paints the story of where crime's happening, who's committing crime, and how much money they need to solve crime, right? And so then city councils just give them what they want. This is the first time in my lived experience, and I've been working on this issue for 30 years, that the community will and the political will are so well aligned, right? You would have thought we cut $100 million in June, because by July 1st, there were all these things that police couldn't do. The other half of that question is, where do settlements from lawsuits come? They come directly from the general fund, up to $1 million. And after that, the insurance kicks in. Kristen, did you want to weigh in on that as well? Was that an accurate answer? Nope, right on the money. Okay.
Oh, actually,
Yes.
technically, the police settlements are so expensive that for regular city employees, the deal is up to $1 million, but for police, it's we have to pay out of our general fund $2 million, or it might be 2.5, but it's a special deal for the police because their settlements are some of the biggest settlements. So yeah, and the insurance premium for that, I think, is something like a couple $100,000 a year.
Kristen shaking her head up and down. My financial advisor is agreeing with you. So I guess for me, the question is, just knowing what you know, you showed me yours, I've showed you mine. Where are we in alignment? I think we're in alignment around values. Is that true? Thumbs up, thumbs down? Neutral?
I think there is alignment in values, right? So at Imagine Black, we are an abolitionist organization. We believe in a future, and hopefully one that doesn't take 400 years of struggle, as is the precedence. Like abolition is coming out of the abolition of enslavement, the abolition of Jim Crow, and now the abolition of the prison industrial complex, which includes policing as well as the actual carceral state, and the way in which, instead of responding to people with care, we respond to them with punishment. So I think there's an alignment in like the frameworks, but our framework is that policing are not necessary. Not necessary. They act violently because they're inherently violent. And we make incremental or hopefully large change in order to eventually not have that be a system in the way in which we organize and depend on them currently.
I appreciate that, and I'll just be straightforward with you. You know, I won't live long enough to see abolition, but I will do everything I can while I have a bone in my body to actually transform policing from what it is today to what it can be in the future, right? So I want to be straight with you on that one. Let's see. So there's an audience question: will defunding the police impact 911 operations? And I'll just read the whole question, and then you guys can jump in if you'd like. I like the idea of defunding the police, but I also want to make sure someone always answers 911 calls in a fire/medical emergency. Actually, that's mine, because it's all the bureaus that are in my portfolio. Let me just say, cutting police will not impact 911 services. In fact, putting more money into advancing Portland street response will be a much better first responder for many of the calls that we're getting today. In fact, the biggest number of change, the biggest change in 911 calls has been for unwanted people, right? And what does an unwanted person look like? They could be houseless. They could be suffering from mental health issues. They could just be Black, and they're in a neighborhood that somebody thinks they don't belong in, right? So this idea of people calling 911 and demanding police show up because there's an unwanted person is totally inappropriate. And we need to retrain the public that it is not okay to be calling 911 because you don't like what somebody looks like, or you don't like that they put a tent up across the street from your house. And I think the police have done a good job of training people to call 911 and ask for police for a whole host of situations that they have no expertise in dealing with. And so as we continue to change policing, as we continue to change how people who responds to 911 calls, because this change, when it happens in January, will be the first time we've changed first responders since the 1900s. And then we just went from volunteers to paid, right? So we are on a journey. And as my friend, Reverend Dr. Leroy Haynes says, this is a marathon, not a sprint, right? So, but you're because of you, we were able to get $15 million cut in June. And because of you, I hope we will be able to continue that path and defunding police and reinvesting it in community. We have probably, this is going to be the last question, and then I'm going to give all of you a chance to give closing remarks before I give closing remarks. But let me just say what a pleasure it is to work with real dedicated community volunteers who are committed to actually making sure that this city is better because of the work that you're doing. And the work that you are doing definitely will make our city better. So let me just thank you there before I forget. Last question. Actually, there isn't a last question. The last question is, can each of you offer some final words about how people can be engaged in the work that you're doing? And what's next? How would you like people to get involved with your organizations? I'll start with you, Lamara.
Yeah, you can reach out to us at imagineblack.org. You can send an email and then connect with anybody who works there. My work is around abolition and defunding. I would like to behoove people to realize that abolition is a public safety model. When our needs are met, our access to housing, living wage jobs, transportation that gets us to that job in a timely manner so we don't get fired for being late all the time. Those are things that will bolster our society in a way in which the need for policing slowly becomes obsolete. And this might sound like totally wild, but there was a time before police, right? And there will be a time after. And hopefully when that time comes, we've done the groundwork enough to ensure that the people who are most marginalized by policing, Black people, folks with disabilities, Indigenous folks, folks with mental illness, and people who live at those intersections, as well as queer people, trans people, are safe, right? We know that people who are in those identities right now are not safe. Yes. So I really behoove people to think about, what does safety look like, right? Does it look like somebody you don't like in your neighborhood and then you call the cops to get them out? Or does it look like everybody in your neighborhood has access to housing and can live and therefore be happy and be fulfilled and thrive? So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Jasmine.
So you can reach me at jasmine@uniteoregon.org. I'm the Black Lives Matter organizer, so my job is to engage with the Black community and the immigrant and refugee Black community as well here in Portland and around Portland. What that entails is reaching out. I've done a couple of reach out to people. So if you see my email, please answer it and respond so that way we can have a wonderful conversation. If I haven't emailed you, email me and we can have a wonderful conversation. One thing that you can help right now is, like I've been saying, that action tool. Please, please, please go on our website, use that action tool, or use Imagine Black's action tool. Get the word out that this is what the community wants. Some things that we're trying to do at Unite is really center around anti-Blackness within our own community and within other communities as well. Just to revert back, the data shows every 15 minutes a police officer responds to a call from an unwanted person in their neighborhood. Every 15 minutes. So that's what the 911 calls are being used for, is someone calling like Lamar and the commissioner has said, just for someone that you may not like. So yeah, again, just to say my email, it is jasmine@uniteoregon.org. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Young.
Hi, I want to just say that join an organization to begin with, because for all of us to really make a difference, we have to act collectively and build people power. And so by joining an organization, you could either join one of the 22 organizations that are part of the coalition that makes up Portland People's Coalition, Portland Metro People's Coalition, or join another organization to become a new member of our coalition, or become a member of the, I think we're calling ourselves the Portland, the Police Accountability Network, a broad network of organizations, including Unite Oregon, Portland Cop Watch, Portland Resistance, DSA, and so on, that are working on multiple things having to do with policing. Everything from the ballot measure, important ballot measure that the commissioner is leading, to defunding the police, and also working on the police contract to make sure that we have a police contract that can hold police accountable. So for all of those, you do need to act as a member of an organization rather than an individual. So first step is join an organization and bring your organization along to this organizing space.
Thank you all so much. I tell you, we're in good hands when we have leaders in our community like you three. I am really honored that you chose to be here with us tonight, and to preview your demands and see our demands. In closing, I want to remind people to check out rethinkportland.com. This is the 6th community conversation that we've had, because what we know is that, as has been so eloquently stated tonight, everyone doesn't feel safe when an armed officer shows up in a community. And in fact, for many community members, they feel less safe when people with weapons show up. And I want you to know that I am absolutely committed to making sure that we rethink what community safety looks like from a public health perspective, because that's what we should be. That should be the lens that we use. I want to remind folks that tomorrow morning, there will be an opportunity to sign up for the budget forms that will take place on the 28th. It is, and I want to remind everyone that in order for my budget to be approved, I need 2 colleagues to support this effort. And Commissioner Udaley has been a strong supporter and champion since we've been working on this. And just like the last time, not sure where the other votes come from, but hopefully your organizations can help us make those happen. It's been a real pleasure this evening. And what I love about working with this group of community members is that we don't have to agree on everything, but we get to work on the things that we agree on and be strong champions for creating a safer, more equitable Portland. And so I would be remiss if I didn't thank Matt McNally, my fabulous community coordinator, and Kristen Johnson, who's the best budget analyst on the planet. And last but not least, Derek Bradley, who does all my policy work behind the scenes. Thank you, staff. Thank you, community members. Thank you all. Have a fabulous night. See you next week, Wednesday, the 28th at City Council. Thank you all.